Shalom everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Haftarat for Hebrew in Israel. I'm your host Yoel Halevi, and this week I am going to be reading the Haftarat of Matot, and I'm specifically doing this because of the fact that depending on the type of year that you have, you read different things at different times. So for example, I'm recording this in 2018, or for the Hebrew calendar 5778, which happens to be a year where we read Matot and mibṣār together. However, on top of that, we actually have the fast of the 17th of the fourth month. I actually kind of refuse to use the regular name Tammuz because of the fact that it's actually the name of a pagan deity, and I just prefer not to use that name. But basically what happens is for Pinchas, if Pinchas happens to be before the 17th of the fourth month, before the fast of the fourth month, then you actually read, from, let me just check that again, you read from the book of Kings, the story of Elijah, where he goes to the desert and so on, and then you actually read Matot separately and mibṣār separately. So Matot's reading is the beginning of the book of Jeremiah, chapters 1 to 2, chapter 1 to 2-3. Yemenites read a little bit longer, a little bit shorter. They go to 1:17. However, the majority read until 2:3, and then you read mibṣār the week after that, where you go from Jeremiah 2:4 all the way to 2:28, and you also add the end of 4:1 and 2. That's the Sfaradim. The Ashkenazim do something very, Ashkenazim and Temanim, or Yemenites do very similar, but instead of reading 4:1 to 2, they read 3 verse 4. But in any case, because of this dynamic of how it switches depending on the period, what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to read all the different Haftarot and publish them accordingly. So this one specifically is going to deal with the Haftarah of Matot, which is the beginning of the book of Yirmiyahu, the book of Jeremiah, the prophet of torment, probably one of the most suffering prophets in the Bible. He is heavily persecuted. He's not murdered. I mean, we also have cases of prophets which were murdered. This is also part of the complaint which Eliyahu presents before God when he goes to Mount Horeb, when he goes to the Sinai desert, and he says, "Neviecha hagu v'charev," they killed your prophets by the sword. So there's this question of how dare they kill the prophets and everything. And I think Jeremiah is a very, very good window into that reality, because you need to understand that this is still people living in the real world. It's still people living with the regular dilemmas that most people have, and the political atmosphere and so on. So you need to understand what's going on in the Judean world before you even step into this discussion about Yirmiyahu. So Yirmiyahu lives at the end of the reign. He's basically a child during the reign of King Yoshiyahu, King Josiah. Judea is already under the authority of the Assyrians. Judea basically loses its independence somewhere around the time of King Ahaz. Now there's a big debate that goes on about this, and was Ahaz really the one who brought the Assyrians in? If you go to 2 Kings chapter 16, if I remember correctly, Ahaz is described as one turning around to Tiglath-Pileser III, saying, "I am your servant and your son," which by itself is a very unusual language, because no one uses the term "your son," at least not in that period. This is a term the Hittites would use, but this is not a term the Assyrians would use. The Assyrians expect someone who is not a blood relative to say, "I am your servant." So there's some questions regarding the entire description there, and there have been even scholars who say Ahaz was only really King Ahaz was only exercising his political right that had already existed, because the subjugation of Judea, or the basically surrender of Judea to the Assyrians, was something that already happened during the times of King Uzziyahu, or Uzzah, or Azariah, depends which book you look at. But even though you can argue that, but it's not very clear. It's a very difficult period to reconstruct. And I actually wrote a research paper about the period of King Ahaz, basically that one chapter in the Book of Kings, which is you have other parts which appear in the Book of Chronicles, but because of the certain difficulties that historians have with Chronicles, I was actually instructed by my professor not to go into the Book of Chronicles and only focus on the Book of Kings. And it was a very, very difficult thing to reconstruct, and it was very difficult to conclude who's doing what and why and so on. Now, this is at least 100 and something years before Jeremiah, the story of Ahaz, King Ahaz. It's around the year 734, 733. The King Tiglath-Pileser III, you can't really call them an emperor. They're not really an empire. But they're basically controlling through creating vassal kings. Vassal kings are kings who become servants of a greater king, servants of a much more powerful king. This is already the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This is the third role of the empire, of the Assyrian Empire, rolling into the Levant, going in and basically conquering. Tiglath-Pileser basically goes out to punish the Arameans for a rebellion, and he basically goes through. And then there's the big question: what sparked this war? But this is around the time when Judea basically becomes the servant of Assyria. And Ahaz turns around to Tiglath-Pileser III and says to him, I surrender, I am your servant, I am your son, please protect me from these armies. And this is still around the time of the prophet Yeshayahu. This is before King Hezekiah or Chizkiah. This is there's an ongoing debate. It's a very interesting thing when you actually read the first 39 chapters of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah. It's telescoping a very, very long period of time, but you don't really see it. You don't really see that we're talking about two different kings in two different situations, and sometimes the prophecies get kind of mishmashed together. So you actually have to understand that part of the prophecies deal with the times of King Ahaz, and the other part of the prophecies deal with the times of King Chizkiah, King Hezekiah. And they're dealing with two different kings under two different realities, because eventually what happens is the Assyrians wage war eventually against King Hezekiah. Ahaz, unlike his son, Ahaz basically says, I surrender almost immediately. But Ahaz has a very simple reason to surrender, and his simple reason to surrender is because he needs protection from other armies as well. So one of the things that I present in my paper is this argument that maybe King Ahaz had no real choice, and we're reading this in a retrospect. But again, this is something that hopefully I'll be able to translate this paper. It's a very long paper, so it's almost like a booklet. What I wrote, if I translate to English, will be probably around 60 or 70 pages. So I might actually have to do this in three different parts. But God willing, hopefully that will happen. And the King Hezekiah, on the other hand, is a king that turns around to the Assyrians and says, I don't care. I mean, in the beginning, he surrenders. He does surrender because he's already under the Assyrians, but then eventually he rebels against them, which makes the Assyrians very spiteful towards Judea. But we need to also understand that Judea was the back part of the empire. It was basically the border between Egypt and Assyria. The only reason the Assyrians actually cared about anything and cared about Judea is because Judea was one of the borderlines, or the borderline between, or the line in the sand, you can say, between them and the Egyptians. It's very interesting that there's always this war between the north and the south. It appears everywhere. It appears in this reading as well. It's a very short reading, so this introduction is very, very important in overall, but it also adds obviously time to the recording. But I think the introduction is very, very important. We need to understand this war between North and South. Hittites versus the Egyptians, Assyrians versus the Egyptians, Arameans versus Judea and Israel, the Assyrians versus everyone in the south. There's always this pressure between north and south, because the land of Israel is the border between Africa. And by the way, Africa, it's very interesting. The term Africa actually has nothing to do with the entire continent of Africa. It was actually Afrique. It's basically North Africa of today. It was the name the Romans gave the northern part of Africa, basically from Egypt all the way to Morocco, just that top line, the top part of the African peninsula. But that's a late Roman name. Before that, each place was named by its own name. Egypt was Mitzrayim. There was, inside Mitzrayim there were different cities. There was the land of Kush, which is what we recognize as Nubia, parts of Ethiopia today. But basically, there's always this pressure between, because Europe didn't really exist, by the way. It's really important to point this out. Europe was a nothing at this point. I mean, there were Greeks developing at this time. We know there were Greek soldiers in the Judean army. There's quite a few indications of this. Hittites being mentioned in different places. But Europe was almost non-existent. The only real powers were Africa and Asia, what we call Asia today, or the Near East, which, by the way, was usually originally called just the East, because the connection to the Far East, China, Japan, and so on, was very mild at the time. It wasn't until much later until we start really hearing connections between these areas. India was in the picture because there was a trade and so on. But essentially, basically, what we have is a pressure from the north always onto the south. Egypt is always trying to squeeze itself in. There's always this dilemma: where do we go with? King Hezekiah trusted the Egyptians. The Egyptians basically folded back. Actually, I think around the year there was a battle of the Battle of Altika, which I think was around the year 690 or 680. I don't remember exactly, to BCE. Egypt was basically defeated. I might have the date wrong. What happens is sometimes when you do recordings, your mind starts rushing into other details. Oh, that's another important detail. So these are things that's worth looking up anyhow. But basically, the Egyptians lost to the Assyrians, and from that point on, Egypt was basically almost a nothing. We all talk about the pharaohs. The pharaohs carried on everything, yes, but the moment Assyria and then Babylon stepped into the picture, Egypt basically went into a decline. This is why Rome eventually was able to control Egypt, because the Assyrians defeated them, the Babylonians defeated them, the Persians defeated them, and basically Egypt went into a very, very long decline that went on for several hundred years. But we also need to understand that Egypt was controlled. There was a pharaoh, but in many cases there were districts, and there were regional little pharaohs, you can call them. There's a process how one great pharaoh came up because many other little kings basically gave up their power, but then it kind of dispersed again. So Egypt never really recovered from this. So from around the 7th century BCE, Egypt is no longer a real strong player in this world. And the North becomes the power. The North, for many, many centuries, was the power. The Egyptians, it's a very interesting thing. The Egyptians were basically very self-contained. And they only really went to places, and really the Egyptians were not an empire, they were a kingdom. And basically you have this power struggle, and Judea is stuck in the middle between all of this. So King Hezekiah eventually decides to rebel against the Assyrians, but it's not very clear exactly, from an historical perspective, it's not very clear exactly where, if all the time, was this a specific period? It's very unclear, because again, we have a mishmash of information here, because we also have a certain ideology regarding King Hezekiah. So it makes it very, very difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on. But if we jump ahead to Jeremiah, Jeremiah is already after King Menashe. King Menashe is the worst. I mean, King Menashe basically is the reason there was a destruction. Actually, if you read the description of King Menashe, and you read the description of King Ahaz, there are some similarities there because they're trying to. The Book of Kings is trying to basically create a relationship between Achaz and Menashe. Menashe himself calls his son Ammon. Okay, and after Ammon comes if I remember correctly, King Josiah, and King Josiah basically starts reversing everything. And this is around the period where Jeremiah is born, and then basically we have the lost kings of Judea, the remnants of the remnants. Basically, Hezekiah and Josiah are like the lost great kings of Judea. But really, when you look at the list of kings of Israel, kings of Judah, most of them are okay, but there's a few of them which are just really, really bad. And Menashe is considered to be the worst. Really, there's a prophecy that kind of basically points to Menashe, saying, this is the reason destruction happened. The damage Menashe created was so massive that it's quite possible that Judea never really recovered. And this is why, for example, finding the Torah scroll, finding the scroll, the book of God in the temple was such a big thing, because they basically, after Menashe, who's described in the Midrash as being someone who persecuted everything about Torah, even though Chronicles describes him as a king who repented, and that's, again, as I said, Chronicles is always a problem. There's always a difficulty with Chronicles. And this is why, as historians, we prefer to kind of slightly avoid Chronicles as much as we can, even though, for example, Oded Bustenai was a very, very interesting writer. He's still around, as far as I know. And if I'm not mistaken, I think I actually have the opportunity maybe to meet him very soon. But in any case, the problem that we have is that we're reading things through very specific ideals. So some of it can be argued as not being necessarily purely historical, but really, in truth, all historians also write narratives. So there's a purpose, and every time you open up a history book, someone's really trying to sell you a narrative. Some historians literally write it as a story. There's some historians that have noticed that they're basically telling you a story. And there's some historians that give you much more dry details, but the purpose is still the same, that they're still trying to sell you a very specific narrative. And we actually see that in the Book of Kings. There are places where you can see that there's a narrative and there's someone's telling you a story and it's designed in a very specific way. And other places where it's a little bit more dry and you realize maybe this is from some inscription or some document or chronicle or something like that. So Jeremiah steps in. Jeremiah lives in a period where Judea is under King Josiah, under one of the better kings of Judah, but the shadow of Assyria is hovering over their head. Okay, this is not Babylon yet. This is before Babylon steps in. Assyria basically kind of steps out at one point and then is defeated by Babylon. And if you understand, Assyria and Babylon are just cities. When we think about Babylon and Assyria, these are just cities. These are cities that their function was to control the regions that they're in. But essentially, these are just cities. And I had a professor, I think this was in my second year. She basically said to me, Assyrians, Babylonians, same thing. And she wasn't wrong. It's the truth. It's very interesting. So really, the armies that destroyed the temple, and this is also part of the purpose of why we're reading these at this specific time and so on, is because it has to do. These are the three prophecies of chaos, the three prophecies of destruction, because we're dealing with prophecy. We're dealing with the parashiyot, which are in between the 17th of the fourth month and the 9th of the fifth month, basically what they call Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. These two fasts. So there's 3 weeks where the prophecies need to deal with the period, and this is where we sometimes have slight changes in the readings. And but in truth, the Babylonians were basically a continuation of the Assyrians. So the destruction of the northern kingdom is really part of the destruction of the southern kingdom. And it's really Assyria that destroyed everything. But it's under the name of Babylon because it was just under a specific kingdom. or a specific, we can call a city-state, basically. And that's really how a lot of it worked. On the other hand, what's very unique about Israel and Judah is that there were capitals, and Israel and Judah were in some degree very similar to Egypt. Unlike, or the Hittites, unlike, for example, you have areas where you have these cities and they struggle with one another, and you really, if you go into documentation from the ancient Near East, you'll see this struggle between cities, and they have their properties and everything. And the whole thing about Assyria was it wasn't a capital city and everyone agreed to be under it. It was a capital city that basically conquered everyone else. Egypt and the Hittites actually had a capital city, and that's what Israel and Judea were doing. Because the northern kingdom, even though there were 10 tribes, you can say 9 tribes underneath it, there was still one king, one capital city, and it was just agreed to live together. Same thing with Judea. You have Benjamin, you have Binyamin and Yehuda, parts of Shimon as well. Levites were basically scattered everywhere. So you can't really talk about, a tribe in the normal sense, territory and so on. But they agreed to live under a specific capital city, underneath a specific king. So by that, Israel was very, very unique. If you go to the Arameans, the Phoenicians, and so on, these were city states. It was a little different. But in any case, so Jeremiah basically prophesies from a period of the transition between Assyria and Babylon. But it didn't really change much of the problems that they were having. It didn't really change much of the difficulties that everyone in the region had, because basically you're either under this guy or that guy. They're basically almost speaking the same language. Their writing system is exactly the same. Their dress code is exactly the same. Their gods are based more or less the same, except for the fact that in Assyria the main god was Ashur, and in Babylon it was Marduk. And eventually, at one point, it was also Baal. There's a whole issue there of who was supreme god at the period in these different cities. But basically, Jeremiah is living in a period which is really one long thing, which is really the atmosphere that we get. But the only thing many of us don't realize is that there's a cut in the middle where Assyria basically is conquered by Babylon, but the Assyrian presence, the Assyrian army, is still there. There might have been some rebellions, and this is part of this discussion that might exist, because Hezekiah basically almost led a rebellion against the Assyrians, but it might be that there was a reason for it, and it might have been the weakening of Assyria and so on. But eventually, Assyria is conquered, Babylon steps in, but Judea still lives in the same existence, still being a vassal kingdom, still under control. So we read about King Josiah as, this great King Josiah and everything, but what we don't realize is that King Josiah, essentially because of his grandfather and his father, is a vassal king. He doesn't really have much power. But what's very interesting is King Josiah does a religious reform. He gets rid of the idols and everything. He could do this because the Assyrians didn't care. As long as they're being paid their taxes and there's no rebellion, they didn't care. It wasn't that King Josiah was attacking another kingdom under Assyrian control, and then the Assyrians will say, you're inspired, you have an aspiration here to gain power, then we'll bring you down. No, King Josiah was allowed to continue doing whatever he wanted inside his kingdom. The Assyrians and then the Babylonians didn't care. What they cared about is pay me my taxes and don't wage war against me or anyone who's under my jurisdiction. And that's really what the Assyrians cared about. So Judea, basically, whatever king steps in, that's the one in control, that's the one doing everything. So during the times of King Josiah, we have a very positive description, but then there's a question here about the prophecies that we have in this specific section that raises some questions about was everything really peachy during the times of King Josiah. So it says, דברי ירמיהו בן חלקיהו מן הכהנים אשר בענתות בארץ בנימין. So words of Jeremiah, son of Chilkiyahu, from the priests which are in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. So first of all, it's very important to realize that Yirmiyahu was not from Judea. He was a Benjamite. And what's very interesting, by the way, the Benjamites, the entire land of Binyamin, was less afflicted when wars were against Judea, because Benjamin had the right to, as tribes, they had the right not to rebel. And it's very interesting. North of Jerusalem, which is the area of the land of Binyamin, there's almost no destruction. It's a very interesting fact. Now he lives in a place called Anathoth. There's a place called Kfar Anata. There's actually a village that maintains the name. Basically, when Muslims came to the land of Israel, they preserved many of the names because, in truth, in the land of Israel, I think there's only one city that was actually built by Muslims, by Arabs, which is if I'm not mistaken, it's a place called Ramla, not Ramallah. It's Ramla. And today now there's a few other cities, a few other places that they've built, but up to I think the 1960s or maybe 1950s, most of the places that Arabs live in are actually on the basis of another town that used to be there, usually a Jewish town. So they preserved a lot of the names. So sometimes when you look for a site, you check what is the name of the Arab village not too far away. I say, okay, this place must be around somewhere around here. So a lot of archaeological sites have been identified based on the fact of the preservation of the names by Arabs. So he's in the land of Binyamin. It says, Asher, verse 2, Asher hayad devar Adonai elav, which the word of the Lord was to him. So this only gives us really a background. So it's a very, very long background. Most prophets have this. Ezekiel, for example, has a double background. But it gives us pinpoints the time. Though in Jeremiah, it's very important to remember, the prophecies are set based on a principle, not chronology. This is why you sometimes have prophecies which are out of order, because there's a point being made, and it's not really chronological. So it states the time, it says, Asher hayad devar Adonai elav, and the word of the Lord was to him, B'yemei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda. Okay, so in the days of Josiah, son of Ammon, by the way, is an Egyptian name. It shows you that Menashe was actually very strongly inclined towards the Egyptians, and there's a whole question about what exactly was the psyche of Menashe. There's even this argument that says that he might have been traumatized by the destruction of Judea, and he decided to disagree with his father. There's a whole interesting attempt to reconstruct the history. But he names his son Ammon, which is basically the name Amun, which is an Egyptian god. Melech Yehuda, king of Judah, b'shlosh esrei shana melchot, 13th year of his reign. So we know Jeremiah was, we assume Jeremiah was a child. He was very, very young when he was first dedicated to prophecy. And it says, Yehoiakim ben Yoshiyahu melech, and it was in days of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, ad tom ashte esrei shana letzidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Judah, until the end of the 12th year to Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah. Now it's interesting, Zedekiah was really the cousin. They were cousins, these different kings. They basically stepped in. But what's very interesting here is that it mentions in the days of Jehoiakim. So it's quite clear that probably what happened during the times of King Josiah was the dedication. But the prophecies themselves really started around the time of Jehoiakim all the way to Tzidkiyahu. Tzidkiyahu, by the way, originally was called Mataniah. King of Judah, ad gelot Yerushalayim b'chodesh hachamishi, until the city was exiled. The city of Jerusalem was exiled in the 5th month. This is around the time. This is the time when the city was destroyed. There were several exiles. It's very important to point out that this is the final exile, but there was multiple exiles during this period. And for example, Ezekiel happens to be from the priest who lived in Jerusalem, who was exiled earlier on. So Yehezkel and Yirmiyahu are contemporaries to one another. They're actually living at the same time, one up in Babylon, the other one in Judea. Jeremiah ends up being a prophet in Egypt as well. He actually travels with a caravan down to Egypt, but they're contemporary to one another. And Yehezkel happens to be the priests that were taken up. So it's very interesting that there's this claim that Jeremiah wasn't the only priest. Yehezkel, we know, was a Kohen as well. But there's even a claim that maybe even Isaiah was a Kohen. That one's a little shaky, that one, but it's if that's true, it's a very interesting reality. So then it says verses 4, 5, and 6 are basically a dedication ceremony. He touches his mouth, which is, some people try to connect to the idea of the mouth opening ceremony that was known in Egypt. It's not really the same. But the idea of placing on the mouth to enable the person to prophesy, basically a divine touch of the mouth, is a symbol that does appear in different cultures, does appear in different places. So there's a lot of symbolism here, and as I've explained before, Israel lived in its environment, which meant that symbols which were common everywhere, everyone used. It's just they gave it a slightly different interpretation. But what's very interesting here is the predestination. This is a very, very unusual thing. I mean, for a lot of Christians, for example, predestination is natural. It's something that is promoted in Christianity because of certain elements of theology. But amongst Israelites, it's very rare. You only really hear this with Samson, you hear this with Jeremiah, but we never really hear it much with other prophets or other characters. For example, in the book of Judges, Samson or Shimshon is the only one that we actually hear predestination. In the book of Samuel, the predestination is dedicated by his mother. Shemuel, his mother says, I will give him for le'olam, I'll give him for eternity, I'll give him for forever, to God. His mother dedicates him. We don't really hear much about predestination or prededication. Most people are selected somewhere along their life. So predestination, there's some questions here of predestination, and I think that during the Second Temple there was a big debate about this because, for example, some of the people in the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically, it's very difficult to pin if it's really Essenes or not, but we know that a certain group believed in predestination to a point where it's either you're sons of light or sons of darkness. There's nothing in between. You're either, if you're a majority of certain signs, you're sons of light. The other can be sons of darkness. But predestination is not very clear in the Bible, and I'm pretty sure that people out there say, "Oh, Yoel's not telling the truth." But from what I've seen after, I don't know, 30 years of reading the Bible from a very, very young age, I am not convinced of the principle of predestination. I'm actually more convinced of the principle of responding to what human beings are doing. This is part of the issue of free will. You have free will, and that means that you make your decisions how you're going to do. God has his ultimate plan. Free will is not completely free because your decisions affect you as a person. So if you do the right thing, then God walks with you a certain path. If you do the wrong thing, God walks another path. Okay? But the whole idea of free will is that there are many, many things that a person could do throughout their entire life, or an entire nation could do in their entire existence. And based on what the nation or the person decide to do, there's a path you walk on. And that's how it's structured. But if God says, I need to intervene here directly, that's when God takes away free will. But free will still exists. God just has the power to take it away if necessary. And I think that's really what we're looking at here. God says, I need to intervene here. I need to select someone and therefore, unfortunately, take away their free will and give them a destination. Now, it doesn't mean that, today many of us look for meaning in the sense of, looking for something that will give us meaning in life. So you're destined to do something. I've always had this feeling that God wanted me, pushed me in certain directions to be where I am today, causing me to meet very specific people, interact in certain ways, living my life in a very specific way. But I don't think this is necessarily predestination. I actually am pretty sure that if I would have decided I don't want to, then God will say, okay, I'll send you somewhere else. But we are, because we grow up in our lives and we're born into very specific families and we go through very specific experiences, that there is a certain element, and I'm not self-contradicting myself here, there's an element where you're naturally inclined to go somewhere because of your upbringing and so on, but you still have your right, you still have the ability to choose differently. It's like I know people who grew up in really, really rough neighborhoods and they got out of it. Usually the way, for example, if you were part of an ancient society, if your father was a farmer, you were expected to be a farmer, And I think this is why predestination was a very strong thing with certain cultures, But today we see it's not necessarily like that. The cycle doesn't have to exist in that way. You also have people who come from good families, from strong families with money and everything, and kids can do whatever they want, and they go down into the garbage tube, and that's where their life ends up being. So I think there's free will, and it's more about generalized things that can happen, and when I mean generalized, I mean there's like a general idea where your life is going to go, but that's really up to you sometimes. And in the case of Jeremiah, God says, I'm taking away your free will in a certain aspect. Your life is going to be dedicated to be a prophet, and this is what you're going to do in your life. But that's direct intervention. So it says in verse 4, 5, and 6, Vayhi davar Adonai elai le'emor, the word of the Lord was to me, saying, Beterem etzarcha v'beten yidadicha, before I created you in the womb, in the stomach, I have known you. Uveterem tetzeh mirecha mikdashticha, before you came out from the womb, I have dedicated you. Mikdashticha comes from the word kadosh, which means holy, but here the root kuf dalet shin really means to dedicate. There's a lot of literature about this whole discussion about, I don't know if entire papers, but I've seen quite a few discussions about, what does it mean? How to use the word kadosh or kadash in this sense, and is it always to sanctify? Is it always an element of holiness? Or is it a word that's used in overall to indicate the principle of being dedicated, and sometimes it means to also become holy? Navi lagoyim netaticha. This is a very interesting thing. This is a prophet to the nations I have placed you. And it's true, Yirmiyahu, like Yechezkel, and Yeshayahu also prophesied to the nations. So prophets were not limited just to their social group. They had to talk about everyone around them, because it is part of a much larger global plan that God has. So God does have an ultimate plan. This is what I said earlier. He's going to push humanity to a very specific place. Okay, there's an ultimate plan somewhere. Okay, which we actually have that in the prophecies, which means that God also has to move there's always this imagery. Those who've watched old movies or movies that deal, for example, with Greek mythology, you have characters and the gods are moving the characters on this board for them to do certain things and so on. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same way, but the principle is shared. There's a principle here where God basically says, anyhow, humanity and time and the universe are traveling on, say, like a line or something, like an assembly line, and eventually it's going to reach an end there. But what happens internally is a slightly different thing. So it's like it's very difficult to describe these things. We all theorize about how exactly God governs the world, and I think that I always go back to the book of Job, the end of Eov, where it says, God turns around to Eov and says, you don't know how all these animals interact and how they do things and so on. You want to know how I do things? So today we know more about zoology and everything, but there's a vast universe surrounding us. There's the ocean. We actually heard someone say we know more about space than the ocean, which is a very interesting thing. So there's always more to learn, more to develop, and really the vastness of the universe is so big that if we can't comprehend our environment, how can we even comprehend God? So we can only see by what we see around us to try to get a glimpse of how God interacts with us as people. So Jeremiah responds and he says, "Va'omar," and I said, it's a yell out of, oh no, it's a negative reaction. So it's a yell. And he says, Adonai Elohim hine lo yadati daber ki nar anochi, says, I do not know how to speak, for I'm a young boy. It says, I don't have the ability to stand in front of everyone and say, you're doing everything wrong. This is probably why Jeremiah is actually given some time to grow up. So this is why we have the triple opening where he has Josiah, Yoyakim, Yeshayahu, Yoyakim, and Zedekiah, or Yoyakim to Zedekiah. So God responds to this and says, Vayomer Adonai elai, al tomar naʿar anochi. And the Lord said to me, he responds to him, do not say I'm a young boy. Ki al kol asher shalachacha telech. For everything that I send you to do, you will go. V'et kol asher atzavecha tedaber. And everything which I command you, you will speak. He's forcing him. It's very important to point this out. This is direct intervention. This is taking away his free will. But he says to him, Al tira mipneim, do not fear them. Ki itecha ani la'atzilecha ne'um Adonai, for I'm with you to save you. Basically, la'atzil means to save, but also to protect. The word itself also means to protect and not just to save. Ne'um Adonai, the word of the Lord. So then he's obviously seeing a vision. We're not told it's a vision, but now we see the vision. Now, some people might argue this was happening in the physical world, but this because it opens up the word of the Lord was to me, and Jeremiah is described throughout the book as having dreams. There's even a place where he has these chapters 30, 31, 32, something like in that area, where he's receiving all these positive prophecies, all these good things, all these wonderful, beautiful descriptions that gives you joy when you read them. And really, if you're feeling a little down, go read those verses. They fill your heart with joy. And so, but it's dreams. It says, "But my sleep was comforting upon me." It was obviously Jeremiah is functioning under the works of visions, of dreams. So this is to me at least, this is a dream. It says, "Vaishlach Adonai et yado," and the Lord stretched forth his hand, "Vayiga al pi," and he touched upon my mouth. And this resembles some ceremonies of hand touching, opening the mouth, and so on. He's basically putting the words in his mouth. Isaiah goes to the same thing. An angel touches his mouth with a piece of coal. Ezekiel has to eat a scroll. This is all about opening their mouth so they are prepared, because prophets are the mouthpiece of God. They are. There's even I think there's some study on the word navi, prophet, which really has to do with the idea of speaking out loud. Navi, some people translate also as messenger, but if I'm not mistaken, there's one study I saw quite a while back. The word Navi means to call out loud. Vayomer Adonai Elai, and the Lord said to me, Hine natati devarai b'ficha. Behold, I have placed my words in your mouth. And he says, Re'eh, see, basically pay attention. I apologize for all the noise in the background. I have no control over people honking their horns. Israeli driving. If you ever come to Israel, be prepared. A lot of aggressive driving and a lot of honking. It says, behold, I have accounted for you today. Pakad means to account for something and decide to act upon. That's usually how I interpret this word. So I have accounted for you today. Today, hayom hazeh, al hagoyim ve'al hamamlachot, upon the nations, upon the kingdoms. Lintosh ve'lintots, to abandon and to smash, or to destroy and smash. Ve'la'avid ve'la'aros, and to destroy. Basically, la'avid ve'la'aros is using double words, and lintosh ve'lintots both have to do with crushing and destroying. La'avid ve'la'haros, it's very difficult. You have a hay stuck in the middle. To cause destruction and to destroy. Basically, he's using the same words twice. Livnot ve'lintoa, to build and to plant. So basically, what he's been dedicated here to is to basically describe the destruction of nations and the bringing back of nations back on their feet. But what's very interesting is some scholars identify this as being a little bit of what's known as the dedication of a king as well. Some of these terms, for example, to plant and to build, or to build and to plant, for example, appears in I'm trying to read here a document that says there is a description of one of the kings of Babylon, that when he's dedicated to be king, he says, the Lord, which is the God, the command is, which I'm trying to translate as well, which makes the decision between the gods, saying to destroy and to create, abatum ubanu, and the word and this decree became. Basically, this resembles to some degree speech that we find placed in the mouths of gods in the ancient world of divine decree towards someone of authority. So what's happening here is Jeremiah is not just being dedicated as a prophet, he's been dedicated as an authority. This is why he has the power to go speak to the king directly and say very harsh things to the king. He's not just a prophet. He is now a figure of authority. And this is why this language is being used, because it's something that you can identify. If you read this book and you lived in the ancient world, you say, I know what that means. Jeremiah is not just dedicated as a prophet. He has authority. He's given the authority so he can go and knock down on the doors of the king and say, you're doing wrong here. So now, after he's dedicated, he receives a lot of visions. So it says, verse 11 says, Vahi devar Adonai elai lemon. The word of the Lord was to me. And he says to him, Ma ata roe Yirmiyah, what do you see? Now, it was very common with prophets to give proverbs and stuff like that, or imagery. So it says, what do you see? V'amar makel shaked ani roe. I see a stick of the almond tree. Now it's interesting, it says makel shaked. So the word shaked here is very, very important, because if you don't know the Hebrew, you lose the idiom. But I also want to focus on the word makel here for a second. The word makel can also be understood. It's not the word mateh or shevet or anything, but the fact that he's seeing a makel. He's not seeing a branch. He's not seeing the word anaf. He sees a makel. Now, think about Aaron. Think about Aharon. He has his staff. It sprouts with almonds as well. The word makel here is not chosen by chance. It's actually supposed to represent the idea of authority as well. It's a stick. It's a stick that's given. It's presumably as if given to Jeremiah as a staff of authority, and the staff of authority contains the shaked, which is the almond. But the word shaked here, the staff is in the hand of Jeremiah, but what sprouts out of it represents the will of God. It says, Vayomer Adonai Eli, verse 12, the Lord said to me, Hetavta lirot, you have seen well, you have observed well. Ki shoked ani al devarai la'asot. Shoked is to sit, to think, to concentrate upon what his decision. I am sitting and concentrating on my words to do. Okay, to do it. But you lose the word shoked, the almond versus the different translations translate a little differently, but you lose the play here on words shoked and shoked here. So Jeremiah is presumably seeing a staff of authority with God's will sprouting through it as a growing. And I think it works really well with the idea of the decision making by responding to things. Now it's growing. God's decision is growing out of the stick, because it's maybe representing the idea of, now I'm responding to the behavior of mankind. So I have to sit and think and make a decision how I respond to this. So then he has another vision, which has to do with, where's the enemy going to come from? Remember, I mentioned the north earlier. It says, Vayidevar Adonai Elai shenit lemor, and the word of the Lord was to me a second time, saying, Ma ata roe, what do you see? Va'amar sir nafuach ani roe ufanav mipenei tzafon. And he said, and usually people explain this as being, the most common explanation is, I see a burnt pot, and it's turned. Some people say it's turned over, but it's facing north. Some people say sir actually has to do with the word sira kotzani, or sira kotzani, which is it's a small bush, very, very common, by the way, in the land of Benjamin. I have had clothing ripped by this stuff when I used to live in that area. It's a very, very low shrub, very, very thorny. Sheep and goats love that thing, by the way. They eat it all the time. So this is why the region is very good for raising small animals, specifically sheep and goats. So some people say, oh, this is actually representing a thorny plant, and it's when it dries out, the thorns kind of blow away in the wind. So facing north means that the wind is blowing and causing the thorns to direct to the north. It's an interesting interpretation, but some of it makes sense, because the thorns can also represent strife and pain and so on, and so it's a translation I think many people are unaware of, or interpretation many people are unaware of. So it says, verse 14, Vayomer Adonai Eli, and the Lord said to me, Mitzafon tipatach hara, from the north, the evil, the suffering is going to open. It's going to, from there, tipatach is like a door opening. It's going to be a flood of destruction. Al kol yoshvei haaretz, on all the dwellers of the earth. Ki hini koreh lechol mishpachot mamlechot tzafon, neum Adonai. For I am calling all the families of the kingdoms of the north, the word of the Lord. Why all the families of the kingdom of the north? Because the Assyrians bound everyone to them, which means if you had an army and you are part of the vassal kings of Assyria, then you have to join the army as well, because your responsibility as part of being a vassal king is always come and protect your king, your greater king. So I'm bringing all the kingdoms of the north against the dwellers of the land, which is the land of Israel. So he says, oh, sorry, I already read that verse. Uvau, and they will enter and they will come. V'natnu ish kis'o petach she'er Yerushalayim. Each one of them, they will enter the land and they will place their thrones or their chairs at the entrance to the gates of Jerusalem. Val kol chomoteh saviv, and all its walls all around. Val kol arei Yehuda, upon all the cities of Judah. Basically, the main thing here is that all the enemies are going to show up and they are going to place their authority, which is represented by their thrones, everywhere. And the entrance to the city, on the walls, and all the cities of Judah. Basically, Judah is going to be completely lost. But why everywhere? And why the walls? You have to ask the question, why the entrance to the city? You can understand. That's where authority figures, but why the walls? And why all the cities? So it says, "V'dibarti nishpatai itam," and I will speak my judgments with them, basically against them. Al kol ra'atam, because of all their wickedness. The wickedness is what's being judged here. Asher azavuni, which they have abandoned me. Ve'kateru le'elohim acharim, and they burnt incense to other gods. V'ishtachavu le'maaseh yedehem, and they bow down to the deeds of their hands. So what's the whole idea of the walls of the city? Because we actually have descriptions, and we actually even have images from the ancient world where people were burning incense to their gods on the walls of the city, because it's a higher location from the bottom of the city. And then the villages, all the towns and villages, they would do it in open space because they don't necessarily have a wall. So it's almost Italian law. It's our Italian punishment. Italian means an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, with the principle of exactly as you have done, I am going to show you how I'm going to retaliate to that by doing something very similar, if not completely identical to what you did. So it says in verse 17, you fasten your waist, and this actually might might also have to do with the idea of, like I've mentioned in other places, tying up the clothing, your skirt between your legs to be prepared to do actions. And you will arise and you will speak to them, et kol asher anochi atzaveka, all which I will command you. Al tehat mipenehem, do not fear them. Penachitecha lifnem. As a result, if you fear them, I will cause you. Do not fear them. For as a result, I will cause you to be defeated before them. Don't fear them, because if you do, I will cause you defeat. So it's just using the word chatat, okay, which is the root here, in a double meaning. Don't fear them, because if you fear them, I will cause you to be defeated. So in verse 18, and behold, I am placing you today like a fortified city, and to a metal pillar, an iron pillar, and a wall, and a brazen wall. Al kol haaretz, upon all the land, to the kings of Judah and its ministers, to its priests and the people of the land. Amaretz here, by the way, is not necessarily just people, farmers. Amaretz is actually a term which appears in some places to indicate the wealthy people, the landowners, which are the wealthy people. And usually in kings' courts, wealthy people were involved as well. Basically saying no one's going to be able to defeat you. They'll attack, they'll throw stones and everything, but they'll never be able to conquer you, because you are an undefeatable. There's an undefeatable barrier between you and them. Whether the symbols of a brazen wall and stuff like that, there's actually places where we find there's an example of a brass citadel which was discovered in Tuprak Kale in the mountains of Ararat around the 7th century. So it's around the same time of Jeremiah. This is probably based on the type of name. This is more of a former Hittite region. The Hittites by this point didn't really exist anymore. So the symbol here is actually something that you would find in the ancient world as well. Verse 19, they will battle against you, and they will not be able to defeat you. For I'm with you, the word of the Lord, to save you, to protect you. But what's very interesting here, with all this negativity, the prophecy actually ends with something very, very positive. And this is very, very common because you don't want to end with something sad or negative. So we add the end of the prophecy, or the end of the Haftarat really ends with 2:3. They said Yemenites end at 1:17, which is the end of the chapter where I just read. But we always, almost the end of the chapter. But we usually always, and most customs, added one more verse, and the last verse here is from 2:3. It says, Kodesh Yisrael Adonai. Israel is holy to the Lord. Jeremiah is holy. Israel is holy as well. God is not doing this to abandon and destroy just because he can. He still cares and loves for Israel. So this is why this verse is chosen. Kodesh Yisrael Adonai. Israel is holy to the Lord. Reshit tevuato, the beginning of his harvest. Kol ochelav yeshamu. Anyone who consume them will be found guilty. Ra'at tavo alehem neum Adonai. Evil will come upon them, the word of the Lord. And really, what's very important here is really the beginning of chapter 2 is introducing a principle that God still cares and loves for Israel, and it's an antithesis to the principle, or the idea that God is being defeated. For example, as some nations would have believed. Usually in the ancient world, if you're defeated, then your God is defeated. But God is the one doing all of these actions, and He's actually doing it because He cares for Israel, and for Israel to be proper in His eyes, He has to put Israel through torment. There has to be a certain element of suffering. And some secular people say, this is just vicious. But you have to think, if you're a parent, you do the exact same thing. If your child goes in the wrong way, you have to educate them that their actions have results. You have to take responsibility for your deeds. And this is what's being told here. It's not just, bribing God and always like throwing something in His direction. He's always going to love us. He loves you. He cares about you. But sometimes He has to do certain things to educate you, to punish you, to realize that you don't get a free pass for everything that you do. A child can make a mistake over and over again, and the parent will say something and warn and everything, but eventually there's a point where that's it, we're done. I've had enough. So next recording will be the recording of mibṣār, which will continue from where we just stopped, Jeremiah 2:4. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Next recording might be a little bit shorter because there's no need to the introduction. But still, I hope you enjoy this. Remember, if you want to support these recordings, you can go to HebrewInIsrael.net. There's a donation button there. And if you want to communicate with me, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, or on Facebook, Hebrew in Israel. Kol Tov.